Oh, I like it. Very quiet, very quickly. How's everybody doing tonight? Fine. Which I feel like in this day and age, fine is like excellent, you know? Thank you for coming out on this terrible day. I haven't been outside for hours, but it was awful out before. Is it still awful outside? Well, you are all heroes. Although, as Ellen reminded me last time she was here, it was at the beginning of the pandemic and everyone came out. So, like, you got to live up to some real heroes. I am Aiden Flex-Clark. I'm the director of Live from NYPL. And like I already said, I am thrilled that you're here with us. I'm thrilled for everyone who is joining us online. And we are going to learn tonight about a pivotal and complex figure in the history of the women's rights movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And appropriately, it is Women's History Month. So this would be a great event any time of the year, but we're very glad to be doing it during this month as well. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is the subject of a new biography, aptly titled Elizabeth Cady Stanton, A Revolutionary Life, which, of course, was written by the great historian Ellen Carol DuBois. Who, side note, just informed me that Elizabeth Cady Stanton actually used to live right here at the corner of 43rd and 5th Avenue. So if you want to go tromp out in the rain and try and figure out where she was after you leave, I encourage you to. Ellen is, of course, the author of many books, including her last, Suffrage, which, like I said, I believe was one of the last in-person events we did here before the pandemic, and we're thrilled to welcome her back for this book. She's going to be speaking with Julie Suk, who is an author and professor of law at Fordham University School of Law. Their full bios are in your printed programs, and if you're watching online, they're on the live stream page as well. Hopefully you saw that Ellen's book is available for sale outside, and maybe you even bought a copy or two before you came in, but fret not, if you haven't purchased it yet, there will be time to purchase it afterward. I very much encourage you to do so. She'll be signing copies of the book here on stage after the event, and all proceeds from your purchase go to benefit the New York Public Library. Of course, I'm not even going to ask. Obviously, you all also have library cards, because you would be a monster to come into this event without one. And so you can use that card to get Ellen's new book, any of her previous books, and Julie's books as well. This year, I'm sure you know the nation is celebrating its 250th anniversary, and we are very grateful for opportunities like tonight to highlight pivotal but sometimes overlooked figures in our nation's history. I'm sure that you know a lot of institutions around the country are marking the 250 years since the Declaration of Independence and the birth of the United States. We are no exception. We're going to open multiple major exhibitions in this building starting in May. Plus, we are going to offer a whole slate of public programs, educational offerings, reading recommendations, and a whole lot more. If you're interested in any of that, I encourage you to go to nypl.org/US250. Among the numerous exhibitions that are going to be here in this building, one is going to explore the history of activism in this country and the labors people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton have taken on to help fulfill, or at least try to fulfill, some of America's promises. But there's much more past that as well. The library actually has incredible collections pertaining to feminism and particularly suffrage movements of the 19th and early 20th centuries right here in our Manuscripts and Archives division. For example, we have the records of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which was formed in 1890 and is not easy to say out loud in front of a crowd. They fought for complete political equality for women and led the struggle for passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, and their first president was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You all fail. Hopefully some of you saw that there's a display of some of these items outside, and if you didn't see it on your way in, it will be up on at the end of the event as well, so I really encourage you to go check it out. It was curated by my colleagues on the public programs team, Margie Cook and Miranda Konar, in collaboration with our colleague in Manuscripts and Archives, Meredith Mann. It's an amazing case. Please go check it out if you have not already. And if you're curious to learn more about how to do research in those collections, I would recommend reaching out to manuscripts@nypl.org, when they will tell you all the ways that you can access those archives with that library card that you all definitely have. Because, you know, we have all of these incredible collections that you think would be sealed under glass and inaccessible, but it turns out we are a public library, and all of these incredible things are accessible to you as long as you have that library card that I know you have. When you walked in, you got questions along, or note cards along with your programs. These are for asking questions. During the talk, please write them down. My colleagues will come by periodically to collect them from you, and Ellen will be happy to answer as many of them as she can at the end of the talk. And if you're watching online, you can put your question in the chat, and we're glad to hear from you there as well. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Ispahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and of course, by all of you here. So thank you again very much for being with us. Let's please give it up for Julie Suk and Ellen Carol DuBois.
I came out too soon, but I came back.
Good evening. So it's wonderful to see everyone here tonight. Thank you so much for being here. And I want to thank Ellen DuBois for this amazing book. It was a wonderful read, and I'm so excited to be in conversation with you this evening.
Tell them about the last time and when it was.
Oh, yes. So the last time we did the Ellen and Julie show, it was exactly 6 years ago. So I guess March 3rd, 2020, and it was the last New York Public Library event before everything shut down for the pandemic. And we talked about the amazing book, Suffrage, where she tells the story of the long struggle, the multi-generational struggle for the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution. And I'm really delighted to be back to talk about Ellen's biography of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, A Revolutionary Life. And I'm especially amazed to note that when we were here in 2020, it was the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And we were talking about Ellen's book, Suffrage. And this year, in 2026, we are celebrating or reflecting on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution, and some say the birth of American democracy, the birth of our nation. And it is an interesting year to be reflecting on the set of questions that the experiment launched 250 years ago, and particularly with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and this is where I wanted to invite Ellen to begin. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the author of the Declaration of Sentiments, which was presented at Seneca Falls in 1848. And it was, of course, a response to a reflection of a rewriting of the Declaration of Independence and a reflection on the revolutionary heritage and potential of that document. So if we could start there talking about, Ellen, if you could tell us a little bit about her authorship of the Declaration of Sentiments and how she thought about its place in American history in relation to the Declaration of Independence.
Well, Julie, this is great. Nice to see you all, and thank you for coming and really filling the auditorium. Elizabeth would have been very happy. Okay, when she and I think 3 or 4 other women who sat down to prepare what would be the first women's rights convention in the world, they pretty quickly realized that the preamble to the Declaration of Independence said everything they wanted to say with a few exceptions. So the preamble they changed in 2 ways. The first way is where the preamble talks about the rights of men, they said the rights of men and women. And I have to tell you, since there's no way to amend the Declaration of Independence, it still says the rights of men. Then the other part that they had to change, these were very small changes, is the Declaration talks about the tyranny of the king. And they talked about, there wasn't one person, they talked about the tyranny of man towards woman. Now, they used it in the singular, and they meant the collective of men. You might say mankind. It's an interesting decision because Stanton, for her unceasing critique of male dominance, had 5 sons, a 50-year marriage, and a lot of male friends. So she had a mixed relationship to men, and I can talk about that. But when you go on, that's just the preamble. Then you get to the grievances. And on July 4th, when you hear the Declaration of Independence, they only read the preamble. They don't read the grievances because they're completely irrelevant, almost completely irrelevant. Like one grievance is about the quartering of soldiers. Now, there's another grievance about standing armies. I used to think it was irrelevant. Unfortunately, I don't think it is anymore. But the grievances for women in the Declaration of Sentiments, the term of which, by the way, was borrowed from the use of the Declaration of Independence by the abolitionists. And they called it the Declaration of Sentiments. I've never been able to satisfy myself about why they use that word, a word that's about emotions. But the Declaration of Sentiments, the grievances are all almost all relevant, or many of them still are. The two which really struck out to me, there are 13. One is that the subject of the sentences is man. Man has given a separate morality for men and for women. And then the other one that stuck out to me is man has done his best to lessen, I think she uses the singular of women, woman's self-confidence. And that's still quite relevant. Now, we now know, our generation, I think, has come to understand that we've become aware that the promise of equality and democracy for all is accompanied by a consistent and disturbing failure to deliver that promise universally. It was at the beginning a failure to deliver that promise to slaves, to women, and to unpropertied men. So much so that even Abraham Lincoln, in his first inaugural address, talks about not about a perfect union, but about the need to create a more perfect union. And I think we increasingly understand that that's our task. We will never get to a perfect, but we want to get to a more perfect. I think this recognition that the patriotism that we embrace is joined by an awareness of the failure of our country to deliver on its promises to so many, sets the context for understanding the other side of what it's important to say about Elizabeth and the Declaration of Sentiments, which is, while she could see that the Declaration of Independence captured a promise of democracy and equal rights that she wanted to embrace for women, like the founders themselves, she had her own contradictions when it came to applying those promises and those rights to all equally. I think I had a great review in the Wall Street Journal. Just check on it. But she used the term about, I can't remember the term, about sort of under men who didn't have standing and rights. And she too held back in sharing that promise to starting in this period to the former male slaves. And it was in particular in the context of the 3 constitutional amendments which rewrote our Constitution, as Julie is the source, is the center of her work, that when it came to the last one, the 15th Amendment, which promised in a very qualified way protection of the rights of men of all races, it ignored women. And it was in that context that she opposed the 15th Amendment and indulged in some of the most, she was a great writer and a great speaker, but in this period, her way with words turns ugly. And she uses the word Sambo, And she contrasts the daughters of Jefferson and Washington with what she called the daughters of bootblacks. And Frederick Douglass said to her, "Why are the daughters of bootblacks less important than the daughters of Jefferson?" Nonetheless, I want to take it in one more step, which is to understand why if there are reasons I could bring to bear on why she failed at this important moment. And there were a couple directions. I'll just lay them out, and then maybe Julie might press a little. One is her personal life. She grew up in a very elite family. The only black people she knew as a young person were her parents' servants. And that contrasts a lot with Susan B. Anthony, who grew up with, because her parents were Quakers, with other black people in Rochester. Then there was an intellectual shift which affected her. She began sharing the abolitionist conviction about equal individual rights. It was about individuals. And in the context of the Civil War, society began to be talked about as a society. It's when sociology is first invented. And so she begins to think about groups of people and their differences, including the differences of men and women. And finally, there was the political context, the incredible disappointment that she suffered when the revolutionary changes that brought to an end the Civil War ended with the exclusion of women from political rights. And I just want to say one thing, which is her severest critic in these years, the mid-'60s, was Frederick Douglass, who criticized her for using the word Sambo. But it's important, I found it important, and I put a lot of emphasis in the book on the fact that after the drama of Reconstruction had ended, she and Douglass became friends again, and they remained very close for the next 20 years of his life.
So, yeah, I think this is a really important issue because in many ways, even I remember with the suffrage centennial, because of the limitations of some of the white women who were leaders of the suffrage movement, I think that there was a lot of emphasis placed on their racism, and in some ways their legacy was tainted because of unavoidable racism epithets that you see in their writings. But I actually wanted to ask you how we should think about that, because on one level the narrative is, well, they were kind of people of their time, not really around a lot of black people, and therefore kind of clueless on issues of race. On the other hand, there's definitely stories in the book that show that it was strategic in many respects, especially at the time where she and Susan B. Anthony decide not only that they're going to oppose the 15th Amendment, in part, I think, to be fair, out of frustration that on the one hand, the women's movement and the abolitionist movement seemed tied together in terms of making everybody a voting citizen in the United States. On the other hand, with the 14th Amendment, voters are defined as male, and the word male enters into the US Constitution for the first time in Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. And there's a real frustration and disappointment and maybe even a sense of betrayal. And even when you think about the Declaration of Independence in relation to the Declaration of Sentiments, I've often asked myself, is it a rewriting out of anger and resentment at the hypocrisy of the authors of the Declaration of Independence, or is it just kind of a trying to make better, trying to make more perfect and extending? And of course, it's a little both, but especially when we get to the 15th Amendment, there are conscious choices that you write about in the book, like the decision that they make the decision that they're going to work with George Train, who is seeing an opportunity to use women's suffrage to promote white supremacy and to try to go against equal rights for Black people or any gains that might be made because of the Civil War amendments with regard to suffrage for Black people. So I guess this is one where looking at the sources and reading the narrative, I wanted to invite you. And I don't know if this is also something that changes at different points in her life, but I think that there are moments where you think that the racism is just, she's no more racist than everyone else, and everyone is very limited during this time, versus there's a strategy and an opportunity that white supremacy presents that's then taken when it could not have been.
Well, this is, of course, in some ways the question that led me to write this book, although I've been living with Elizabeth for 50 years. But it's why I felt she really, I really wanted to try and write a balanced biography of her. Let me try and address it in several ways. I think you started by saying, what should we learn from this? And I would say one thing we might learn is to be to be aware that we ourselves are also limited by the moment that we live in, and that we don't see things that our children and grandchildren will see very clearly. I think it was E.P. Thompson who spoke about the enormous condescension of the present to the past. So I think it's very unfortunate that that the greater awareness that we have come to achieve about a more balanced understanding of our country's legacy should be accompanied by a sort of universal, well, what's the word that's being used? Erasure. What's the word that's used? Canceling. The canceling of so many people. Now, you know, maybe we should cancel John Calhoun, but should we cancel Abraham Lincoln? I do feel that in some ways Elizabeth has been canceled because when you read her, she's so fresh. The way she writes doesn't feel old, doesn't feel antiquated. And she remains, I think, of all the suffragists, a person of controversy now, so many years after her birth. I guess the other thing I want to say is that you talk about it as strategic. I think it's important to realize that with the possible exception of Douglas, most of her former allies were angry at her less for her spoken contempt for African Americans, which some of them probably, African American men, by the way, which some of them probably shared, although they didn't speak it. But for them, her great sin was turning her back on the radical Republican Party and its policies for Reconstruction. And she and her husband were kind of Democrats. They were kind of Jefferson Democrats, or Jackson Democrats, actually. And they had not turned against the Democratic Party in the same way that so many abolitionists had. So there's much more to say, but you'll have to read the book and tell me if you think I got it right.
Yeah. So one of the richest aspects of the book is your accounts of her experience of marriage and motherhood. And I wanted to ask you about how her personal experience of marriage and motherhood shaped the reform agendas that she developed over her lifetime around both marriage reform, the possibility of divorce on various grounds, as well as voluntary motherhood.
Okay, well, before I talk about her experiences as a wife and mother, I do think there's one aspect of her personal experiences that did shape her attitudes, and this was her experiences as a child. If her autobiography can be believed, she locates her kind of instinctive revolt against authority from her experience, from her parents, from her nursemaids, and especially from her experience with the conservative Presbyterianism in which she was raised, to reject what she called, learning in her as a child, what she called the everlasting no, no, no. And there are ways in which she was committed. She was always committed to if she was told not to do something, she was pretty much inclined to do it. And that underlines both the high points of her career, but also the low points, such as this one. Now, if I can move to wife and motherhood. She was, as she said, as she insisted, she was married to the same man for 50 years. Now, other women in her cohort were too, but there are, let's take Lucy Stone, for example. Others of these women had difficult marriages. There are records of infidelity, and there's none of that in the Stanton marriage. Now, by the 70s, they were beginning, that's the 1870s, they were beginning to live separately, but they remained attached by their parenthood, by their politics, and by their mutual regard for each other. There's this sort of sad moment in the book when her husband dies when she's in England and she can't be there, and she habitually it was her practice not to express a lot of personal unhappiness. So she just has a little bit to say, and she writes basically to her sons about what their father was and how she remembers him to them. Now, when it comes to her motherhood, the record, I think, is unqualifiedly positive. She had 7 children who lived to their full adulthood. 1 died before she did, her first child. There's some indication she may have had 1 miscarriage. But even if we grant that, it's a very unusual record for this period where like her own mother, most of her pregnancies ended in not just miscarriages, but death of infants. This, I think, can partially be attributed to she was among the authorities she was critical of were physicians, and she embraced homeopathy, which was a sort of rival medical practice. The major advantage of which over regular physicians is that it did less harm than what regular physicians did, who mostly just cut and drugged. So her children, and they not only did they live well, but they all speak very, very warmly of her playfulness as a mother. I guess her anti-authoritarianism carried over into her motherhood, and that some of her friends criticized her for not being a sufficient disciplinarian. There's one story, I don't know if you remember this, but Lucretia Mott is visiting her, and her 3 boys are pretty young, and they've gotten into the habit of saying, damn this and damn that. And she wanted to stop them from doing that. But she didn't just say, don't say that in front of Aunt Lucretia. What she did is she had Lucretia Mott start saying in her Quaker way, thee are damned. Damn thee. And they were so appalled that it did the trick.
Wow.
So she remained close to all of her children. Only one of them, I think, was in any way seriously troubled, and he was the eldest because of his experience with the Civil War. He was a young man in the Army. And two, or maybe by other calculations, three of her children carried forth her legacy. My first experience with biography was writing about her daughter, Harriet. Then her son, Theodore, also was a suffrage activist. Interestingly, they were both close to their mother politically, but they both lived abroad. They needed to get maybe away from her overbearing or overpowering influence. And then her other daughter, she had 5 sons and 2 daughters. Her eldest daughter, whose name was Margaret, turns out to have been the first faculty of physical education at the Columbia School of Education. So she invented physical education. And physical education, or the health of the body, was a very important part of Elizabeth. I guess I need to say one other thing, which is the really amazing thing is that these children were born between 1842 and 1859, 7 children. And it was in these years, especially the 1850s, where she did some of her most bold and revolutionary thinking. She had to do a lot of it as writing. She couldn't leave the house much. And her new friend, Susan B. Anthony, was crucial to helping her do that. But I guess it's like what I was saying about the difference between man and men. Her own experience and her arguments about motherhood and marriage, both of which she insisted must be done by the full choice of the woman, that women were in charge of both of those things, that people have tried to say it was a bad marriage, or some even that she was a bad mother, and it's not true.
Well, one thing you mentioned is the relationship with Susan B. Anthony, and I think there are episodes in the book that show some tension between her and Susan B. Anthony over a range of issues, but I think one of them is that she is pregnant and giving birth so often during this time where she does a lot of her most important thinking about women's rights. And so she's absent from some conventions, and she's often writing a speech that it's Susan B. Anthony who's going to go deliver that speech, or Susan B. Anthony is just kind of telling her, like, I'm expecting all these things, and she's busy looking after small children. So I guess in kind of modern parlance, there was work-family conflict, and this was also something that might have been a source of tension, I would think, between her and Susan, and I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about how she dealt with, because it seemed like the message she was trying to tell the world is that women should not be shut out of public life because of motherhood. And then there was this conflict that sort of came out sometimes in her relationship with Susan.
Well, I want to start by saying, just like I was trying to get to the core of her invidious rhetoric towards former slave men and later in her life towards immigrant men, and I'm not sure I ever got there. I'm not sure I quite got to the core of her relationship with Susan. Maybe you might say it was closest to a marriage, except I'm not going to be one of those historians who tell you that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were actually lesbians. They were not, neither of them. But the way in which they remain trusting of each other, even when they had disagreements, and they had severe disagreements towards the last 20 years of their time together, but they remained trusting of each other. In the beginning of their relationship, Susan came to Seneca Falls and helped with the children. They sometimes called her their other mother. At the same time, Susan was very insecure, as opposed to Elizabeth's, I would have to say, preternaturally intellectual security. And so she becomes very dependent on Elizabeth for helping her to write, for helping her to speak. after a couple decades of their friendship, Susan's more confident, and it's at that point that they separate at one point, actually on the West Coast, and she goes to Oregon while Elizabeth goes home to oversee the death of her mother, and Susan says, it's sort of great. Because otherwise I have to sit in the back, and anybody who dares to come in the company of this woman will be in the shadow. And I spoke much better when I was without her. But she was, I think one of the ways they repaired their relationship is in the period after that, in the 1880s, they wrote the history of women's suffrage together. And it involved going back over the really high periods of their time together. And I think it was a real joy for the two of them to do that, a kind of reliving of those years.
So one of the things I love about the book also, and mostly towards the end, is your engagement of her relationship to religion, and not just religion and Christianity, but the growing tide of the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the temperance movement advocating for a different constitutional amendment at the same time as women's organizations advocating for suffrage by constitutional amendment. So a
constitutional amendment that would constitutionalize Christianity, and it hasn't died. That hope.
Well, I was speaking of the Prohibition Amendment, but of course, I think in your account of Elizabeth Cady Stanton's relationship to religion, a lot of it is her trying to grapple with the Frances Willard and the temperance activists, and by this time, the Women's Christian Temperance Union has a much larger membership of politically active women than the suffrage movement. And so on the one hand, there seems to be an admiration, but it's interacting in a very interesting way with her kind of allergy to Christianity and its place in American life.
Okay, and I want to be careful about this. Often people talk about, it's easy to talk about her allergy to religion. Mm-hmm. It was to Protestantism, okay, the religion that suffused her society in which she grew up in. When she goes, in the 80s, she goes to France with her daughter, and she is first exposed to Catholicism in its sort of natural haunt, as opposed to the immigrants, the poor immigrants who are bringing it into the United States. She's quite taken with the reverence for women that she sees in Catholicism. She and her daughter live in a nunnery which is seconding as a sort of hostile to visiting women, and she's very taken with them. She also, I was happy to see, there are a series of Jewish people, a few, educated, progressive, who she was close to. And the one that really struck me was Felix Adler, who's the founder of the Ethical Culture Society, and whose father and grandfather were the founding rabbis of Emmanuel. People like that, because they didn't grow up with Protestant assumptions, were very helpful for her in rethinking questions about sin and morality. But as I said, her hatred of religious orthodoxy is, if she is to be believed, is there at the beginning, and it leads to sort of one really tragic moment in her life, which is at the end of her life, when she finally is able to devote herself to this question. And because, as Julie says, it was important, she was really concerned about the conservative turn that many suffragists had taken. She puts together a concordance called the Woman's Bible. Now, at the time, reviewers were unhappy with, and people may still be unhappy, it's not a Bible. She and her co-authors take all the quotes they can find in both the Old and New Testaments, and they cut them out, which was already something. They got Bibles and they cut them out, and then they wrote commentary about them. And if you put Elizabeth Cady Stanton as an author, this is one of the two or three books that she didn't really ever write a manifesto of women's rights, which is our great loss. But they're making us stop.
Keep going.
So her colleagues in the suffrage movement censored her and declared their opposition to the Woman's Bible. And Susan, for all her differences, Susan was quite close to Frances Willard, she did her best to defend her friend Elizabeth, but she could not. And so Elizabeth ended her life excluded from the suffrage movement. And that is one of the major reasons that when later generations, including many of us when we were younger, learned about the history of the suffrage movement, it's Susan we learn about and not Elizabeth. Elizabeth had sort of been pushed to the side.
So thank you to everyone in the audience who asked questions on these cards. So I'm going to ask you some of the questions from the audience. So maybe we could start with this question about Frederick Douglass. And the question is, do we know if after Reconstruction, when Frederick Douglass and Elizabeth made up, if they actually hashed out their differences or just agreed to put them behind them?
We don't know if they hashed out. Oh, there's another one. You can pass it over and it can come up to us. There's no indication that they hashed out their differences. There's one moment early on, they're still in the middle of this disagreement, and they're both traveling, and they cross paths in western Illinois. And Elizabeth writes about it, and she describes meeting Douglass, and she says he's wearing a fur coat, and she describes him as the big bad wolf, and that she is the Little Red Riding Hood. But it's playful, a little hostile. The one place where we can really, what held them together was first and foremost, he remained a defender of women's suffrage in an active way much longer than any other male abolitionists. And she revered him for that. But the other thing is that in the 80s, his wife died, and he married a white woman. And this was an object of great anger, not just by white people, but by black people as well. And Elizabeth wanted to defend him because she believed, above all other things, that people had an individual, private, unqualified right to make decisions about their personal lives. They could marry who they wanted. They could have children when they wanted. And she could not get her a defense of him published. But he was extremely grateful. And he wrote back to her and he said, even if you had never written this, I knew this is what you would have thought.
So here's another. What allowed feminism to flourish during this era in ways it had not previously?
What allowed feminism to flourish? Well, I don't think it's quite right to say it flourished.
When do you think within her lifetime, what do you think was the high point of feminism?
Well,
she lived for almost 90 years, right?
First of all, the word doesn't exist yet, okay? So we're still talking about women's rights, and and the fact that she extended the idea to the personal in a way that other people had not and only kept it public. I think that in the period of abolitionism, when certainly it was not the case that women's rights flourished, but it was partners with abolition, and that allowed her and others to think in terms of something which they actually called human rights. And I think that was important. And then the Reconstruction period, where she really thought that would, the early years of Reconstruction, where she thought that would be realized, that partnership, and it was not, was both the high point and the low point. She remains dedicated to the ideas, and if, you know, and when you look at, for instance, her children's carrying on of that legacy, it's clear that she kept it up. What would have been the high point? I think it was probably the period up to the late 60s, because when you read the history of women's suffrage, where they use their language, they still, their language just radiates pleasure and pride in what was achieved. And although the numbers weren't great, to put the issue on the table of progressive change and American liberalism was an incredible achievement.
Great. Well, who were her feminist heroes? And I understand this wasn't a word that was used, but who would you say were her heroes in terms of the values she cared about, women's rights and women's liberation?
Well, her mentor, she credits Lucretia Mott with being her mentor. And she particularly revered her for her uniformly liberal politics, but also the fact that, as she hoped to be and as she was, Lucretia was a wonderful wife, as she would say, a great homemaker, and also a great mother. And she took, I don't think I ever said this explicitly in the book. I think that may have been a model for her. Lucretia introduced her to some of the earlier precedents of women's rights, which she had been unaware of. And she got her to read Mary Wollstonecraft. And so in the magazine that she and Susan edited in the mid 60s, they published the first American published version of Vindication of the Rights of Women. So I would say that those were, I'd have to think a little more. I'm sure there are others, but those were two that I would mention.
Okay. We have a few questions bringing us closer to the present.
Okay.
So one is, why do you think young women are rejecting the idea of feminism and embracing the trad wife lifestyle? And
the what kind of?
Trad wife, traditional wife.
Oh, I'm not sure that's true. I stopped teaching.
Current idea of feminism poisoning the fight for equal rights?
Okay, well, the sort of signature approach of the suffrage movement, which is public rights, and particularly the right to suffrage, you know, it's hard for young women to realize that it was hard to get. And when they learn it, and I say this as a teacher of women's history, and you probably know this too, when you teach your law students, they're quite taken with it, and their own attitude towards voting is deepened as a result. But I often describe feminism as something like a horizon, which as you near it, it goes further away. So in other words, what the meaning of equality for women gets elaborated in ever new ways once we achieve certain aspects. And the place where that's so obvious, and it's beginning to happen at the end of Elizabeth's life, is the question of what her daughter called voluntary motherhood, and which we would call reproductive and sexual rights. And I don't think there's any question but that young women identify with that. During the pandemic, my husband and I went to Georgia to give a talk, and I was wearing very deliberately wearing a pro-choice T-shirt. And I can't tell you the number of young women who came up, usually a little sotto voce, and to tell me how much they loved my T-shirt and to tell me their own harrowing stories of reproductive rights. So I know that tradwives, or whatever it's called, is getting a lot of attention. But my own experience of dealing with young women is not quite that. If we speak in their language, they will understand ours.
So could you comment on a recent House bill trying to limit voting rights of married women?
Yeah, I don't know how serious that is. It is a way for hyper-reactionary men to declare themselves, to say that which is most unbelievable. I don't really think that's what's happening. It is true, I would sort of reverse it and say that African American women are the ones that are standing up for women's voting rights. And they are carrying forward that legacy. I think of Stacey Abrams. And many of the major figures of defending women's rights are African American women. So I think that's a really interesting development and shows us when the circle goes around, it comes around.
Okay, so we have time for just a couple more questions. Okay. So do you think that Henry Stanton was at the Seneca Falls Convention? And maybe you can also talk about the men who were there.
Okay, he was not. Henry, her husband, was actually at the time, I'm not sure if he was in the state legislature, but in the weeks right before the Seneca Falls conference, which was July 14th, 1848, he was just to the west in Buffalo, where he was helping to form something called the Free Soil Party. And the Free Soil Party was the first political party to take a stand against slavery. And as such, it anticipates, that's about 48, and anticipates 6 years later the formation of the Republican Party, which is able to formulate a way of criticizing, of attacking slavery that is capable of rising to become a major political party and to do something that nobody, certainly not Elizabeth, thought would happen, which is slavery to be ended by a civil war so quickly. Now, the men who come to Seneca Falls, with the exception of Douglas, I think, the majority of them, like the majority of women, are Quakers. And they are a significant group of people in Western New York. And they certainly respond to the fact that Lucretia Mott was there. And they're not just Quakers, but many of them are progressive Quakers, something called Hicksite Quakers. So I think the knowledge of the convention is mostly carried through Quaker circles. In the years afterwards, it becomes broader than that.
Great. And can you speak about Native Americans and their influence on Elizabeth?
Yes. Not. There is an argument that Sally Wagner of blessed memory, I hope that's right. I hope I'm not.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sally Rush.
Yes. Has argued that the third author of the history of women's suffrage, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, had a strong knowledge of Native Americans and brought some of that knowledge to bear. I'm not sure that the evidence supports that as strongly as Sally argues. But it is true that right before the Seneca Falls Convention, the reason Lucretia Mott was in the neighborhood is that she was visiting Iroquois peoples in that area, and she was, in fact, familiar with their practices and their. I think she was aware of their somewhat more egalitarian notions of marriage and I wouldn't say women's rights, because the concept of rights is pretty foreign, but to the role of women, the importance of women.
So before we close up the program, I wanted to invite you to maybe name one piece of writing or just one thing that young people who have never heard of Elizabeth Cady Stanton should know about her.
Okay, well, that one's pretty easy.
Okay.
It's a speech she gave. It's something she wrote in and gave in the early 1890s, and it's called The Solitude of Self. And it is an extraordinary piece. She's already in her almost 80 years old, and she's already beginning to experience some of the conservative pressures that's going to push her out. But she's looking back over her life, and she's writing as somebody who's lived a life. And in it, she talks about, she's very existentialist. That's what I say about the piece. In it, she talks about the fact that no matter who we are, man or woman, rich or poor, wealthy, healthy or sick, ultimately we live our lives alone. And so she starts by saying things like, even the most fortunate of wives is likely to face the death of a husband, and then you are left on your own. And she also says, in a more general way, she says, at the high points of our lives and at the low points of our lives, we are alone. You know, whatever joys we experience, whatever unhappiness we experience, at some level we experience, no one can share that with us. And this is, my friend Vivian Gornick wrote a book called Solitude of Self, which is a sort of meditation on Stanton and what was so meaningful to Vivian about her. And it is that she identifies as the sort of enduring feminist core of her beliefs. So it's easy to get, and I urge you to read it.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Ellen.
Thanks for coming out, and I think they're going to bring
a reminder
out
that the
table,
books,
and I'm going to sign books.
yeah, the books are available for purchase, and Ellen will be up here
Yes.
Signing books from the stage. So please come on and say hello and get a book signed. And thank you so much for coming out tonight.